Howdy everyone. Alright, so let me get you caught up on what I've been doing. Nothing too exciting, it's just more baffle details. So I've got the two rear baffles now in place, the rear baffles and the back half of the side baffle. Those are now in permanently, and I think I've talked about this one. This right side has been completely finished. It has RTV in the different areas for sealing purposes. There's a lot of RTV up underneath where it kind of wraps around the cylinder. I've talked about installing the black fabric where the baffle itself rubs up against the fins of the cylinder. I had done that on the left side as well. You can see I got the baffle material riveted in place. And like I've talked about, I put some RTV between the baffle, the aluminum baffle itself, and the seal before I did the riveting. And that was okay, but when the seals themselves start to bend and flex with the cowling, you can see the RTV kind of starts to pull away. You can see there's a pretty good gap here. So I thought, rather than come back after the fact and try to reseal this from the outside, I just went ahead and used some speed tape, some aluminum speed tape, and I added that along the edges here all the way around. You'll note that the what I want to call it, the shop head of the pulled rivet, you can see that it does have part of the rivet itself, the what do I want to call it, the stem, looks like it's still retained inside. I hope you can see that. But you'll also note that the head has a hole in it. Let's see if I can get this. So you can see potentially that those rivets, there's a hole in the rivet. And I thought that's probably a decent leak point. So the speed tape solves two problems at once. It seals up the seam between the rubber baffle and the aluminum baffle, or I'm sorry, the rubber seal in the baffle itself. It seals that seam, and it also seals the rivets. So that's the option I went with. Again, on this left side baffle, RTV, put on the seal, did the riveting, and then I'll come back and I'll finish taping this off with the aluminum speed tape. So you can see I've added some spark plug wires. That was just to just wanted to verify some things with my magnetos. These came with the engine, all 8 of them already pre-made. I don't know that I like the length. I may trim them a little bit shorter. But anywho, don't get too excited about spark plugs and spark plug wires. I just wanted to do some checking on my my PMags. So the next thing that I moved on to is this. In order to fit the front baffles come here, right? And they're really tall because I haven't trimmed them. Those need to be trimmed, but before I can trim them, I need something to trim them to, right? So this front side area of the baffles on both sides, those get trimmed to match the profile. The top cowling on the inside has those fiberglass air inlet ducts. They're pre-shaped, kind of an S-curve. These aluminum side baffles, those get trimmed to match the profile of that fiberglass inlet. So in order to do that, I need to install the inlets. So here's one installed, but not permanently, of course. It's all clecoed. Here is one that I'm working on now. This is almost full size here. I've already trimmed this one back about 1 inch, but this is pretty much full size here. You can see the difference in size and shape between this one. This is the left side, and this one. This one is a lot smaller and it has a lot sharper curve to it. They both come basically this size and this very gentle shape. You'll also potentially notice that the inside of this cowling is now very shiny. So when you read the instructions, they talk about with the lower cowl, they talk about sealing it so that oil and grime and fuel and grease and whatever doesn't soak into the cowling itself. They talk about mixing up a mixture of acetone and epoxy, almost to like a water consistency, and then brushing it on the underneath of the cowling. I decided to do that with the top cowling as well because, again, my plan right now is to vinyl wrap the cowling, and I know others have talked about the cowlings being somewhat full of really super tiny pinholes that you can't even see. And when the cowling gets hot from the inside, it will bubble up the vinyl on the outside. So I went ahead and mixed up a very thin solution of epoxy and acetone to thin it, and I brushed just one coat of that onto the cowling. Once I had that done, I started working on the fiberglass inlet ramps. This inlet ramp here is very small, and here's why. This cylinder here, this is the number 2 cylinder, this is the left side. There's a lot of room between the front of the cowling and the cylinder. This cylinder is the right side, number 1 cylinder, and you can see from the front of the cowling to the cylinder, there's probably about half the space, maybe not quite. It's probably more than half, but you can see there's not a lot of room here. So with the top cowling on, and you've got that inlet fiberglass through here, that fiberglass being large and very gentle in its curve, you can imagine if this is the front of the cowling, that piece goes like this. And with it being long and mildly curved, it will choke right in here between it and the cylinder. You get very little clearance in here for airflow. So you need to take that curve, that long, gentle curve, and you need to bring it forward and you need to increase the bend. Rather than have it kind of sloping, you want it to open up. You want it to open up and then come back so that you've got room in here for air to transition. That's mildly difficult to do. Another thing is these inlet portions of the cowling itself, you can cut these back. That will open up space in here. I have done that. If you recall, there were 3 holes here. You can see a remnant of a nut plate rivet right here. So there was a 3rd hole here, but I had cut this back to give me more space for the fiberglass inlet ramp. I didn't cut it back any further because I wanted a decent amount of material here, and I wanted enough material here to get 2 screws in and the nut plates. Once I had that figured out on one side, I just duplicated it on the other. But this is the cylinder you need to pay attention to because you have limited space in here to get your cooling air to flow. So what I ended up doing was basically trial and error mostly. I just cut this back. I cut this edge off here, and then I would tuck it underneath the inlet. I went ahead and put 3 holes in the fiberglass cowling inlet here. And then I just cut this front edge off of this, move it forward, match drill it to these holes, cleco it in place, and then try to fit it onto the engine, put the cowling actually in place on the engine, and then reach and feel in here and see how much space I have between this and the cylinder. So I kept doing that. I kept heating this with a heat gun and rebending it, and this is what I come up with. I think the spacing is good now between this and the cylinder. You can see that I kept this nice and wide. I haven't trimmed these edges off at all. I put a little notch here because when I was trying to fit this in place, this was actually rubbing on the starter ring. It was hanging up on the teeth of the starter ring, so I filed this back a little bit to clear the ring so I can actually get the cowling in place. These are going to stay nice and wide because the aluminum panel here, this will get trimmed to match this profile right here. So I wanted to keep this nice and wide so that I can guarantee that that aluminum piece of baffle will hit here. I didn't want to cut this back and then have the aluminum piece miss it altogether and just kind of slide down next to it, because now you have a sealing problem. So this stays nice and wide, and then you'll fit the cowling just like you did the other parts of the aluminum baffle. You just put the cowling on, you'll trim that aluminum piece a little bit, fit the cowling, trim it, fit the cowling until you get the cowling completely on. And then using the paper clips on the aluminum piece, you can adjust your spacing. And I'll do all that when I get there. I'll cover that again. But for now, these are going to stay as wide as I can keep them to make sure that the aluminum pieces will hit. That way I can trim them to fit this profile. And I've already got this pushed forward and recurved, so I got a good amount of air gap between here and the cylinder. Now another thing that I've done was, when you look at this, it's a pretty abrupt curve, right? It's not that long flowing curve, it's pretty abrupt. However, I figured it would be aerodynamically fine, just because I have very little experience, but some experience with airfoils. And this curve will still allow the air to flow. It won't separate from this curve. It will, as the air comes in, it still stays attached to this, even though it's a pretty abrupt break, if you will. And I just took a hair dryer. Actually, I used my heat gun without the heat turned on. And I was blowing it along this leading edge here. And with my hand down here, I could still feel the airflow. It wasn't blowing across or, diverting other places. It was still able to attach itself to this curve. So that's all I'm going to do with this one. I'm not comfortable trying to pull it back or bend it any tighter. So this is done. I just have to permanently attach it. You can see on this piece, on the cowling itself, I've got some reference marks. There's a black line here and there's a black line here. When I had the aluminum pieces in place here, I put the cowling on. Now remember, these have been trimmed so that I can get the cowling on, but they have not been shaped to the inlet ramp, right? So I had the cowling pieces completely on. This side piece, the pieces that go in here, all of it. This was completely in. The top cowling was completely in place, completely pinned and attached with screws in place. And all I did then was reach up through the inlet. I reached up in here and I drew those lines where this aluminum piece was and where this aluminum piece of the baffle were in relation to the top cowling. That's where those black marks came from. And those are just a reference so that I know that my fiberglass inlet needs to be wide enough to span across both of these lines, because these lines represent basically where the aluminum baffles will be. And I want to make sure that this is wide enough when it's in place to span both of those. Because again, when this is in, you want your aluminum pieces to hit it. and then you trim your aluminum pieces to match whatever shape this ends up being. Okay? So a really super fast recap. Epoxy coated the inside of the cowling. Put the cowling in place with all of your baffles completely in place. Cowling goes on, completely attach it, reach in, make your reference lines on this side, on this baffle here. This baffle kind of comes in and curves around. Make a reference line for this baffle, make a reference line for this baffle on the cowling, so you know how wide this area is. And of course you do that for both baffles, or for both inlets. You'll have aluminum baffle that goes in here, and you've got this side piece of baffle here. You want to reach in and make reference lines so you know where those aluminum baffles touch the top of the cowling on the inside. With those reference lines, now you can see roughly how wide you have to make sure your inlet ramps can span. You want them to span wider than your reference lines. And then you just work these in to whatever you think will work. Like I said, this one was cut back a lot and bent with heat a lot more severe to open up that space. This one not so much, because you've got a lot of room to work with. But I am going to cut it back because I do want to open this up. I want as much airflow as I can get into these inlets, right? If for some reason I have overcooling, I can deal with that. I mean, that can basically just come down to speed tape. I could speed tape the ports, you know, the different blast tubes or whatever, the oil cooler, whatever it is. If things are overcooling, I can fix that. I can block up stuff if I need to. If I don't have enough cooling air to begin with, I'm kind of screwed. So I'm going to open this one up a lot as well. This side may have more cooling air than this side, but the cooling air, the higher pressure cooling air in this entire cowling will kind of blend together and equal out. So I want as much air coming in these inlets as I can get, and then if I need to spot, if I need to block off stuff individually, I can do that later pretty easily. So this is what I'm working on now. I've got my holes pre-drilled for the clecos. I'm just going to cut this back. I'm going to cleco it in place, fit it to the airplane. If I'm not happy with it, then I'll cut it back even further, bring it back into here, match drill it, cleco it, fit it to the airplane, and I'll keep moving this inlet forward until I'm happy with it. And that's the only advice that I've got. I don't have any scientific evidence saying exactly what shape and how large these things need to be. It's just a guess at this point. Okay? So let me work on those, and I will talk to you guys later.